Okay, great. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining today's CMS Web Interface support call. During today's webinar, CMS will provide an overview of 2019 CMS Web Interface quality reporting for MIPS groups and ACOs. After the webinar, CMS will take as many questions as time allows. So now I'll turn it over to Aruna Jasti to begin.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as ACOs and MIPS group practices prepare for CMS Web Interface quality reporting. I'm Aruna Jasti from CMS. Joining me on the call today are other CMS experts and contractors who will share helpful information on the CMS Web Interface quality reporting and answer your questions during the question and answer session after today's presentation. Today's call will only focus on quality reporting. You can contact the Quality Payment Program Service Center with any of your questions regarding cost, promoting interoperability, improvement activities, MIPS, or quality reporting in general. Next slide, please. This is a disclaimer slide about this presentation. Information in this presentation was current at the time it was published, but please be sure that you are using the source documents and links that are provided throughout the presentation. And please stay tuned to any communication from the Quality Payment Program, Medicare Shared Savings Program ACO, and the Next Generation ACO model regarding any updated information. Next slide, please. The recording slides and transcript for the February 19th call are now available on the Quality Payment Program Webinar Library. Next slide, please. The submission period for the CMS Web Interface aligns with other submission types for 2019, opening on January 2nd, 2020, and closing at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on March 31st, 2020. Your submission will be automatically accepted at submission close. As a reminder, the CMS Web Interface is accessible using the sign-in link on the Quality Payment Program website, which is circled here on the slide. We encourage you to submit your 2019 MIPS performance period data in advance of the submission deadline of March 31st. Early submission will provide you with time to receive assistance from the QPP Service Center, have other CMS approved recent requests reviewed, and complete the CMS Web Interface reporting requirements. Next slide, please. As you may know, today is part of a series of Web Interface support calls held weekly through the data submission period. The next support call will be held next Wednesday, March 11th, 2020 from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Topics will include measure FAQs on controlling high blood pressure measure. Additional topics may be added prior to the support call. Next slide, please. The other CMS-approved reasons skip requests must be submitted through the CMS Web Interface. This is a way to skip a patient attributed to a measure during denominator confirmation. The CMS-approved reason is reserved for circumstances that are unique, unusual, and not covered by any of the denominator exclusions or denominator exceptions identified in the measure specifications. Patients for whom a CMS-approved reason is selected will be skipped, and another patient must be reported in their place for the measure if available. We encourage you to submit a 2019 CMS-approved reason as soon as possible and no later than Friday, March 20th. Submitting after March 20th may result in your request not being processed prior to the close of submission. Next slide, please. The 2019 CMS Web Interface API is available all year for testing in the developer preview environment. You can review the resources listed on this slide for more information. Next slide, please. And now I'll pass it off to Angie Stevenson to go over frequently asked measure questions.
Thank you, Aruna. Hi, this is Angie with the PIMS team. Our first frequently asked question is for the CARE 2 screening for future fall risk measure. The question is, what documentation is required to meet the intent of the CARE 2 measure? As defined on page 5 of the 2019 CARE 2 measurement specification, screening for future fall risk is an assessment of whether an individual has experienced a fall or problems with gait or balance. There must be documentation in the medical record of a falls risk screening that includes one of the following. Number 1 is the patient's history of falls. 2, a described fall. 3, a note stating no falls. Or 4, an assessment of gait or balance. If after reviewing the medical record, you find supporting documentation that meets the numerator guidance criteria, then it would meet the intent of the measure and you would select yes. Next slide, please. The next question is for the MH1 depression remission at 12 months measure. If we have documentation of major depression with a PHQ-9 score of 8, can the patient be confirmed for the denominator? The answer is no. The patient must have both a diagnosis of major depression or dysthymia and a PHQ-9 or PHQ-9M greater than 9 during the denominator identification period to be included in the denominator. If the patient does not have a PHQ-9 or PHQ-9M greater than 9, then select no to the question, did the patient have a PHQ-9 or PHQ-M greater than 9 during the denominator identification period, which is November 1st, 2017 through October 31st, 2018. If no is selected, then the patient will be skipped and another patient must be submitted in their place if available. Question 2 is, if a patient answers the first 2 questions as not at all, and the rest of the questions are blank, is the depression screening considered numerator compliant? No, the 2019 MH1 Web Interface measure specifications guidance on page 6 states, remission is defined as a PHQ-9 or PHQ-9M score of less than 5. Page 12 gives guidance that all 9 questions must be answered to have a valid summary score for the measure. Next slide, please. This question is for the PREV 12 screening for depression and follow-up plan measure. What documentation is acceptable to meet the intent of the 2019 PREV 12 measure? For CMS Web Interface users with an electronic health record that currently reflects the 2018 PREV 12 measure specifications, CMS will accept the same types of documentation you submitted during the 2018 submission period for the 2019 performance year. Similarly, if your current EHR has been developed based on the 2019 PREV 12 measure specifications, CMS will accept documentation that aligns with those as well. For questions that are specific to your organization regarding acceptable documentation, please submit your questions to the Quality Payment Program Service Center. Next slide, please. These questions are for the PREV 12 statin therapy for the prevention and treatment of cardiovascular disease. Is a diagnosis of hypercholesterolemia sufficient for meeting population 2, or does it specifically have to say familial or pure hypercholesterolemia? The answer is diagnosis of familial or pure hypercholesterolemia are the only acceptable diagnoses that may be utilized for Category 2 confirmation. Hypercholesterolemia alone is not considered an appropriate diagnosis for denominator confirmation. Please refer to the HTN coding document, denominator codes, for a list of appropriate diagnoses for PREV 13. The question 2 is a patient allergy to one statin acceptable for the denominator exception, or must they be allergic to all statins? No, the patient does not have to be allergic to all statins. A listing of drugs that may be used for denominator exception can be found on the Denominator Exceptions Drug Codes tab of the PREV coding document. These drugs may be used as a denominator exception if present in the patient's medical record, accompanied by an appropriate conditional reason why the patient isn't taking the drug, for example, adverse effect, allergy, or intolerance to statin medication. There is guidance provided on page 14 of the posted specification, which includes the following. Denominator exceptions should be active during the measurement period. Next slide, please. This slide is a review of the difference between a denominator exclusion and a denominator exception. Denominator exclusions are patients who should be removed from the measure population and denominator before determining whether numerator criteria are met. A denominator exception is when a patient falls into the denominator, but the measure specifications define certain circumstances in which a patient may be appropriately deemed as a denominator exception. Allowable reasons fall into three categories: medical, patient, or system reason. A denominator exception removes a patient from the performance denominator only if the numerator criteria are not met as defined by the exception. This allows for the exercise of clinical judgment by the MIPS eligible clinician. Next slide, please. This slide is to review when to report denominator exclusions and exceptions when medical record documentation of performance met is also present. The first question is, if a patient meets performance for a measure, but there is an applicable denominator exclusion, which should be reported? The answer is, if a denominator exclusion applies to the patient, the exclusion should always be reported, regardless of whether or not the quality action was completed for that patient. This ensures the intended denominator population is captured for the measure. Question 2 is, if a patient meets performance for a measure, but there is an applicable denominator exception, which should be reported. If there is documentation to support the quality action was completed for the patient, performance met, and the patient has an applicable denominator exception, it would be appropriate to report performance met. If the quality action was not completed for the patient and there is an applicable denominator exception, it would be appropriate to report the denominator exception. Thank you very much. I will turn it over to Aruna at CMS. Thank you.
Thanks, Angie. Next, we'll go over available resources and where you can go for help. Next slide, please. Yes. Please note that 2019 materials providing information on the MIPS Quality Performance category are available on the Quality Payment Program Resource Library. We encourage reviewing these resources if you have questions on quality requirements and measures. We will continue to communicate any future postings in upcoming support calls. Additionally, the help and support page on the QPP website contains links to materials such as videos, webinars, and online courses, as well as other items to help with reporting and development. Next slide, please. The Qbb Webinar Library also contains recordings, slides, and transcripts for past QPP webinars, including the recent 2019 CMS Web Interface user demonstration held in November and the CMS Web Interface kickoff call held in December. The recording, slides, and transcript for the January 15th, 22nd, 29th, and February 5th, 12th, and 19th calls are also available on the library. Please note that it may take 1 to 2 weeks to post the presentations to the library following a webinar. Next slide, please. Finally, this slide contains links to resources available for Medicare Shared Savings Program ACOs and the next generation ACO model. We encourage you to review the materials available here and sign up to each newsletter for more information. Next slide, please. And if you need additional assistance, please refer to the contact information listed on this slide. Next slide, please. And just before we head into the Q&A portion of this call, if you're interested in providing feedback and collaborating with CMS on the quality payment program, we encourage you to participate in our human-centered design efforts. To get involved, please email your name, title, topic of interest, and organization to qppuserresearch@cms.hhs.gov. And now I'll hand things over to Ketchum to begin the Q&A session. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so we will now begin the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you have any questions to ask, please submit your questions via the questions tab on your screen, and we will read them out loud, or you can raise your hand as shown on the slide. It's a little green icon, and we will unmute your line. So starting off in the questions box, your first question asks, is there a way to report or document a flu vaccine shortage at a health system at the ACO level?
Hi, this is Jamie with the PIMS team. There is a way to report or document a flu vaccine shortage at the health system level. And within the specification, what that would sort of lend to is the documentation of system reasons for not receiving influenza immunization. And I know that this particular person also had an additional question as an example of a system reason, and that is actually a perfect example of a system reason, having that shortage to the vaccination. Therefore, you're unable to deliver or administer the vaccination for the patient. So hopefully that caller has both, or that person has both of their questions answered. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, your next question asks, for Prep 12 depression screening, if the practice EMR shows in patient notes gait and balance is normal, will that meet the measure? The spec requests that an assessment tool be used, but based on what was just said, can you please clarify whether you are now saying that a note on balance and gait normal would meet that measure?
Hi, this is Olga from the PIMS team. I just want to clarify that I'm assuming this question is for actually CARE 2, which is falls screening for future fall risk. For that measure, there must be documentation in the medical record of a falls risk screening that includes the patient's history of falls, a described fall, a note stating no falls, or an assessment of gait or balance. Medical record must also include documentation of which screening was performed.
Great, thank you. All right, we will take a question from the phone line. Your first question is from Yamini Shah. So Yamini, we are unmuting your line. All right, Yamini Shah, you may go ahead and ask your question.
Hello?
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thanks. Hi, this is Yamini, and I want to speak about the measure depression screening and depression remission. While we were working on the data abstraction, PHQ-9 was excluded while depression, but under the same impression, I think the exclusion was written as major depression, PHQ-9, and that was one of the challenges that we noted while data extraction. So do we consider those patients? How do we measure depression remission in certain situations? Because we know the diagnosis is there, the patient is going to the psychiatrist, but no PHQ-9 was done. And it was written like exclusion, depression.
So this is Katie from the PIMS team. I think there's a couple different components to your question. So we'll just walk through the measure specification. So the first step in order to even confirm the patient in the denominator is that they do have that active diagnosis of major depression or dysthymia during the denominator identification period. And if you have questions about what specific diagnosis would qualify for that denominator confirmation, we would refer you to the MH1 coding document. So you would have that as a reference. It just simply depression alone in the medical record wouldn't be appropriate. You would need major depression or dysthymia during that time frame. Additionally, if they do have the appropriate diagnosis, but they were not offered a PHQ-9 during the denominator identification period, then you would select no to the question of whether one was administered. They need that initial PHQ-9 greater than 9 in order to be denominator eligible.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, your next question asks, does the screening tool for the MH1 measure have to be labeled as PHQ-9? Or if all 9 questions are answered and a PHQ-9 score is documented, will that be acceptable? Can the tool be labeled PHQ depression screening tool instead?
Hi, this is Katie again. So for the MH1 measure specifications, they simply require that all 9 questions be answered in order to have a valid summary score. The way in which that is documented within your medical record is at the discretion of the organization doing the documentation, but whatever you have in your medical record must support that the PHQ-9 was administered and that all 9 questions were answered for that valid summary score. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, your next question asks, who is considered a patient that is skipped in the sample regarding exclusions and exceptions?
Hi, this is Katie again. So each measure specification contains specific criteria that would fall under denominator exclusions or exceptions if applicable to that measure. So the exclusions and the exceptions are really unique to each measure and each situation. In terms of how those are translated, if a denominator exclusion is reported, that patient will be skipped within the CMS Web Interface. They'll only be skipped from the measures for which that option is selected, not all CMS Web Interface measures. An exception will remove the patient from the performance denominator only if the numerator criteria are not met as defined by the exception. So in this case, I believe Angie referenced it a little earlier in the presentation, but if you have a patient that meets performance but has an applicable denominator exception, you would report performance met for that patient. If you have a patient who did not meet performance and has an applicable denominator exception, you would be able to report that denominator exception. So it's really what is more advantageous in this scenario. And then one other distinction I did want to call out is that for the CMS approved reasons to skip a patient, those are truly unique and unusual circumstances. So those would be items that typically aren't covered in the measure specifications, perhaps why a patient did not receive the care as outlined in the measure spec. And then those all go to CMS for review. The CMS medical officer will make a decision based on the information provided and issue a decision whether or not that skip would be approved or denied. So if that patient is skipped, another patient would be reported in their place. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. All right, we will go to the phone for the next question. Abigail Wendland, we're unmuting your line. All right, so Abigail Wendland, you may ask your question.
Hi, thanks. I have a patient who had a colostomy reversal. This patient had a colostomy in 2011, but then it was reversed since then. Would that patient still be a denominator exclusion, or should that patient have had the quality measure performed?
Hi, this is Angie. I don't know that we've had that question before, so it might be best to send that in to the service desk so we can research it? I'm sorry, was someone else going to provide information?
Yeah, I tried submitting it, but then for some reason my case was closed. So I've tried reopening it, but I've heard nothing. So I figured I'd bring it here to see if I could get an answer.
Sure, I'm sorry that happened.
I'm happy to resubmit if
go out.
Solution.
If you want to give me the case number or type it in the Q&As later, I can go search for it and try to get you an answer.
That would be great. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Great. All right. We will, Abigail, we will message you privately to obtain that and coordinate that. All right. Your next question asks, regarding HTN2, does a port flush count as a therapeutic procedure if it does not require a change in diet or medication? And if so, can we move to the next most recent reading?
Hi, this is Katie. So in this scenario, using the last documented blood pressure in 2019 would be correct. So for this measure, the most recent blood pressure is used. If you believe that this is a unique or unusual circumstances, you can try and submit a CMS approved reason request. Again, these are where the CMS medical officer would review and issue an approval or denial as they see fit based on the information provided. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, again, if you'd like to ask a question during this Q&A portion of the webinar, please submit it via the chat box on your screen and we can read it out loud. And alternatively, if you'd like to raise your hand, we will go ahead and unmute your line. All right, so in the meantime, regarding PREV 5, if a patient has refused several times to complete a mammogram and it is documented in medical record, should the patient be excluded from the measure?
Hi, this is Angie from PIMS. PREV 5 does not allow exclusion or exception for patient refusal. If a mammogram was not performed during the measurement period or the 15 months prior to the measurement period, then you would select no when reporting the numerator. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. For the statin therapy measurement, some patients have a triglyceride level that invalidates the LDL-C measurement. Would this invalidate the patient from meeting the minimum of 200?
And this is Deb from the PIMS team. So I would kind of point you towards page 11 of the posted measure specification within the denominator guidance. The second bulleted note does state if laboratory is unable to calculate the LDL-C value due to high triglycerides, select no. Also, if the test result is labeled unreliable and a result is provided, also select no. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, back to the phone line. Yamini Shah, we will unmute your line again. So you may go ahead and ask your question.
Hello?
Yep, you may go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. You mentioned today for statins, either it has to be allergies to all statins or allergy to specific statin, but sometimes we just find that allergies to statins. Is that acceptable or not? And the patient has been stopped on statins.
So it doesn't have to be an allergy to all statins. However, the allergy to the statin does need to be considered active during the measurement period. So if you had an allergy to a statin documented in previous years and nothing in 2019, then you wouldn't be able to select it. And there's also some guidance in the posted measure specification, kind of towards the end, definitely where the table is, the mapping table. I'm trying to scroll to it really fast. That will let you know that when you do that allergy to a statin, you need to have you're going to find the allergy and documented reason for not receiving statin therapy. And that would be on page 24 of that specification. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. All right, your next question asks, does comment on exercise satisfy the fall screening measure?
Hi, this is Olga from the PIMS team. The screening for future fall risk is defined as an assessment of whether an individual has experienced a fall or problems with gait or balance. You do not need a specific screening tool for the measure. However, the specification does give examples such as the Morris Fall Scale and the Timed Get Up and Go test. Also, as previously stated, there must be documentation in the medical record of a falls risk screening that includes one of the following during the measurement period, and that would be the patient's history of falls, a described fall, a note stating no falls, or an assessment of gait or balance. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, next question concerns Prev 12. Does an age-appropriate screening score of 0 still require explicit documentation that screening was negative, or does a score alone suffice that the patient was not depressed and therefore no follow-up plan is required?
Can you please repeat that question?
Of course. It's regarding Prev 12. It asks, does an age-appropriate screening score of 0 still require explicit documentation that the screening was negative, or will the score alone suffice that the patient was not depressed and therefore no follow-up plan is required?
Thank you. So this is Katie from the PIMS team. Just wanted to make sure I heard that right. So as CMS has indicated in previous presentations, any previously acceptable documentation from 2018 will be acceptable for 2019. So in this specific scenario, a score of 0 to indicate negative was previously allowed in 2018, so would be acceptable for 2019. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next question asks, for ACOs and Prev 10 reporting, would a non-tobacco user be counted as a skip or not met?
Hi, this is Jamie Welch with PIMS. Thanks for the question. In this particular instance, I'm making an assumption that you're seeing documentation of this patient being a non-tobacco user, and that actually meets performance for the measure. That would meet performance within population 1, patients who were screened for tobacco use at least once within 24 months, and population 3, patients who were screened for tobacco use at least within 24 months and who received tobacco cessation intervention if identified as a tobacco user. So if that causes you any confusion, please submit a ServiceNow help desk ticket and we will promptly respond to you and help you through that. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll go to the phone line for our next question. So Jason Shropshire will unmute your line. All right, and Jason, you may go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I'm hoping to get some information. I know in previous calls, a couple of users have mentioned this, and we've still heard nothing regarding how depression screening is going to work for this calendar year 2020, because we obviously need to work with our practices to completely change their workflow if things like PHQ zeros or PHQs that are scored as 0 still have to be reviewed and interpreted by the provider. I'm asking CMS or someone on the phone when we can expect an update on this, given that we're already in March.
Hey, Jason, this is Deb from the PIMS team, and I would just say that for this particular call, we can only address 2019 questions. We do have 2020 questions in service now at this time, and we are in communication with CMS, so I'm sure a response will be provided to you as soon as possible, but unfortunately, we can't answer anything outside of the 2019 program year right now.
Okay, and I appreciate that, but can you please explain to them that this is an urgent matter, that we cannot wait until October to find out the answer, as that is well past the point of no return? Thank you.
Absolutely, and they are very aware and diligently working on trying to get those responses to you. It's not something that they're not aware of, but we will continue to work with CMS for sure.
All right, great, thank you for that. Your next question was regarding DM2, concerning A1C per control. If a patient is diagnosed with prediabetes, could that be considered as a diabetes diagnosis to meet the measure?
And this is Deb from the PIMS team. Again, I'm going to point you to the measure specification. Page 5 of the measure spec in the guidance section does state that only patients with a diagnosis of type 1 or type 2 diabetes should be included in the denominator of the measure. So if the patient has a diagnosis only of prediabetes, I don't believe that that would meet the type 1 or type 2 diagnosis. So you would not confirm the patient in that case. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that. All right, your next question asks for clarification on tobacco screening. Is the measurement period from, January 1st, 2018 to December 31st, 2019, or from January 1st, 2019 to December 31st, 2019, i.e. 2 years or 1 year?
Hi, thanks for that question. It's 2 years, so it's the January 1st, 2018 through 12/31 of 2019. You have 2 years to look for that screening to be completed. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. All right, we'll go back to the phone line. Again, if you do have any questions to submit over the phone, please raise your hand and we will unmute your line. So for this question, Yamini Shah will unmute your line again. And you may go ahead and ask your question. All right, Yamini Shah, you may go ahead and ask your question. All right, we'll go back to our questions box. You have a question regarding MH1. It asks, what are the SNM codes on the MH denominator codes?
Hi, so this is Katie from the PIMS team. So the coding documents are used to map to an EHR. So these are actually SNOMED codes that would be utilized when mapping from an EHR to pull data for the CMS Web Interface. These codes can be used as a reference for those who are doing manual abstraction to confirm which codes are appropriate for the various steps within the measure specification. However, I do want to note that for manual, well, in any case, medical record documentation is required to support what you've reported. So again, the coding documents are just they're all-inclusive for purposes of mapping to an EHR, but can also be used as a guide for those who are doing manual abstraction. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, your next question asks, if the PHQ-2 and 9 are both done, but the progress note does not state negative for depression, but they did bill for negative depression screening, is that valid?
Lauren, can you repeat that one again, please?
Of course. It asks if the PHQ-2 and 9 was done, and the progress note does not state negative for depression, but they did bill for a negative depression screening. Basically, can they take that?
So in this instance, your medical record documentation would need to support that an interpretation was provided, either negative or positive. So referring to billing or coding alone for purposes of numerator compliance would not meet the intent of the measure. You would need that medical record documentation clearly showing whether the screening was negative or positive. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, next, in regards to DM2, should we include the diagnosis of diabetes 1.5 type in the denominator?
So this is Deb from the PIMS team. My recommendation, if you're not sure if you should be using something to confirm the diagnosis of diabetes, is to go ahead and refer back to the coding that's provided. That way you can see exactly what type of coding the measure developer intended as confirmation of diagnosis. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, next is asking for clarification. For Prov 7 influenza immunization, if a patient refused immunization, would they be considered a skip?
You have great timing. I was just looking at that. Thanks for the question. Actually, it's not a skip. This would fall under an exception of a medical reason. Actually, yes. So if you go under denominator exceptions on the first page, it's going to be covered under the documentation of patient reasons for not receiving influenza immunization. You'll see the example there, and patient declined is right there. So that particular scenario can be covered as an exception of a patient reason. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, next question concerns Prov 12. Can they obtain missing medical information from the doctor by having the doctor handwrite it in the medical record?
Hi, so this is Katie from the PIMS team. So your medical record documentation should reflect that of services that are provided before the end of the measurement period, which would be December 31st, 2019. So going in and updating medical records during the data collection period is not the intent of using the data collection. You should really be reporting based on what is present in the medical record by the end of the measurement period. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, your next question asks, in regards to obtaining records, we understand that the date cannot be later than December 31st, 2019. However, if the practice is now in March 2020, obtaining records to improve performance, would that be allowed?
So this is Katie. I just want to reiterate the topic that was covered last week. So in terms of whether you're a MIPS group or an ACO, your data should only reflect those services that are provided by that December 31st, 2019 to date. So, I mean, in terms of ACOs, there is an expectation for collaboration, and that can occur throughout the data collection period. However, the stipulation that your medical record should not be updated with information after December 31st, 2019 applies across the board. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that clarification. All right, your next question concerns Prov 13, and it asks, does a diagnosis code of E78 or E78.01 with hypercholesterolemia in the notes suffice to meet the denominator of Category 2?
So this is Deb from the PIMS team. What I would say is the E78.00 and E78.01 are appropriate coding for that particular measure. So what you would want to ensure, if you're using a combination of a code and medical record documentation, it just needs to be able to support confirmation of that diagnosis. So I can't necessarily speak to exactly what you're seeing, but I would anticipate if you're able to find both the proper coding and documentation of hypercholesterolemia, then the combination of those two together would more than likely be acceptable to confirm that patient should be included in the denominator. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, it looks like that's all we have for questions at the moment. So, Aruna, we will pass it back to you. Oh, sorry, we just got one more question in. Again, if you do have any more questions on 2019 with quality reporting for the CMS Web Interface, please submit it via the chat now. All right, your final question asks, we are an ACO. If we collaborate and reach out to get records after December 31st, 2019, can you confirm that we cannot use that information to change or update the EHR for 2019 reporting?
Would someone from the ACO team be able to speak to this question?
This is Kristen from RTI. I would just reiterate the response that was just given in regards to updating the medical record after the measurement period. So I would defer to the response that was just given.
Great, thank you. All right, and we have one more question from the phone line. Chelsea Webb, we'll go ahead and unmute your line. All right, so Chelsea Webb, you may go ahead. Chelsea Webb, you may go ahead and ask your question. Okay, next question asks, can you confirm the 4 measures that are paid for reporting in this performance year? To reiterate, the question asks, can you confirm what the 4 measures are that are paid for reporting this performance year in 2019? Apologies.
Yes, sorry, this is Kristen from RTI. I was on mute. The 4 measures are PREV 10, PREV 13, MH1, and PREV 12 for this performance year.
Great, thank you. All right, your next question asks, is E78.5 acceptable for PREV 13 population 2?
And this is Deb. I did a real quick check, and I would say I did not find that code when I looked, but what I would recommend is going on to the qpp.cms.gov site, go to their resource library, and go ahead and download the coding documents, because you may want to go ahead and make sure that, you know, double check me as I was doing it on the fly, but I do not believe that code is part of that code set, but all of those documents are posted on the CMS.gov website. So qpp.cms.gov. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. All right, so that's all we have for questions today. So Aruna, we will pass it back to you to conclude the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. The slide deck, recording, and transcript from today's call will be available on the Qbb Webinar Library in the next 2 weeks. As a reminder, our next support call is scheduled for next Wednesday, March 11th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And during this webinar, we will cover frequently asked measure questions about the controlling high blood pressure measure. We hope you'll join us. Thank you.
All right, that concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining.